as we can see, science and technology are, I was starting to talk about post-colonialism and eco-criticism, but I want to add a footnote that science and technology are a double-edged sword in the sense that we need them to fight to help our sustainability efforts for broadcasting education. But on the other hand, we know that big companies like Google and things like that, they require so much energy to function and are probably eating up a third of the Earth's energy needs. So this is the paradox we live with. So I thought I would mention that. So back to post-colonial studies, which I think most of you know about, and eco-criticism. They are combined both historically and ideologically. So I want to try to explore that a little bit in this very broad survey that we're doing here. And one reason is that, as we'll see, and as some of you know, European colonialism was indeed what we call modernity in some ways. And it's also what we call globalization, modern globalization. The world has been globalized for thousands of years, but the intense degree and the amount of resources needed to sustain that modern sense of globalization grew with the Industrial Revolution, and those European countries in the modern sense would not have become modern and developed without exploiting so much of the world. So I think that's also interesting to think about. And I think, of course, Amitabh Ghosh and other writers are showing that so brilliantly in their imaginative use of literature to show, for example, in Sea of Poppies, how, 200 years ago, more than that, these historical and economic, political interconnections produced the modern, what we think of as the modern world. There are many modernities, but the dominant point that I think is starting to finally change, but until now, the dominant Eurocentric way. So that's the political economic part. The ideological part is as we'll see, and I'll get to in more detail, how Romanticism in Europe, starting with in Germany, really ironically began in some ways with the translation in India, as you know, of Shakuntala by Kalidasa by Sir William Jones in 1789. So this was a huge hit in Germany and then quickly in the other countries. There are many reasons that's another story about why Germany. In a way, then, these countries saw India, sort of ancient India, as the cradle of civilization, but that had its own problems, right, in the way that they conceived it. So that's the idea. So that informs Romanticism. And then, ironically, as so many ironies of history, Romanticism partly inspired people like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay and others to, they had their own ideas, of course, but so they have this Romanticism that was inspired by Indian ideas that then inspired the modern, anti-colonial ideas. So I love those connections, right? So we'll try to explore that. So those kinds of intersections are what I'm interested in. As you'll see, I like interdisciplinary research, but I'll do my best to spell some of these out. The other aspect of this first lecture is also, which itself is an overview, is also the importance in the modern literary sense of American transcendentalism. So we have people like Henry David Thoreau, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and a few others who read the Upanishads and were profoundly influenced by that, right? And so Thoreau is an eco-critical, one of the forebears of modern eco-environmental studies in many ways, because he goes and talks in Walden about living in 1 year just only in touch with nature, right? He's a brilliant naturalist. by the way. So all of these influences are fascinating, and we can go on and, if we had time, to talk about, and American Studies is not my area, but having taught different survey classes, we can see the influence of the transcendentalists right up until recently, even today in America, with the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac, Ginsberg, who came to India many times, and so on, right? And I think that there are many, many artists and writers who recognize these connections, but the mass public, or especially our junior students, don't always, right? That's where we come in as teachers, right? We can broadcast that and inspire people to look across these borders. And I teach in a university, and now I'm getting way off topic, but I teach in a university which serves a rural population, and they are quite narrow-minded, right? They don't live in a big city. We live in a small town. Many of the parents are farmers and things like that, and they don't travel much. So it's fun to see how you open their eyes sometimes to these connections. And I think that's important today, right, in our world. So I wanted to just start with those broad ideas. Some of the more specific terms that we'll look at, I will touch briefly a little bit later on post-colonial terms, even though in my experience, many people are familiar with the basics of that. So I think the eco-critical part has been developing, came a little later, and has been developing very fast. So things like, of course, we have the ideas of the sublime and picturesque and the romanticism. We have pastoralism and the idea of wilderness. We'll talk about that. But we also have environmental justice issues that are so important today, right? Certainly they have always been, but they are more important. Risk theory, which has become very important. The land ethic, which starts with the American naturalist Aldo Leopold, but really a lot of these ideas have been around for centuries, but they are now applied in a modern sense. So toxic discourse, which I think is very important today as we talk about our polluted planet, and how certain works of literature are really, I think that's how people can grasp that, right? The reality of that. New materialisms, eco-ambiguity, national ecologies. So bioregionalism, petrocultures, and there are others. So that's what we will look for. Okay. So just to get started, I'm going to read from this and sometimes add a few snippets from other points. Maybe a way to illustrate this is when I was at the University of the Philippines in teaching a course one summer about 5 years back, they have a wonderful botanical garden in the campus in Manila. Well, it's a suburb of Manila. And one of the biologists for this literature conference gave us a tour of the botanical gardens, and he asked the Filipino students, what is your national tree? What is your national flower? So they answered, and he said, for each of them, he said, those are not native to the Philippines, right? So we're familiar with ecological imperialism, where starting with Columbus, right? We have what is called the Columbian Exchange, based on Columbus's name, the infamous Christopher Columbus. And that was when, for example, that like green chilies, things like that are not native to India, right? The Portuguese brought them. Potatoes were only in what is now Peru, right? Now they're everywhere in the world. Can you think of Ireland without potatoes, right? Or Irish literature without the potato famine? So those kinds of things are also part of this vast area. But what I think is we need to have an idea of this broad intersection, because whenever we read a text, then we can sort of illuminate it both for ourselves and for our students, right? and maybe make a difference in the world, hopefully. So, I like to keep that in mind. And so the tour of the botanical gardens was disillusioning in the Philippines for the Filipino students, because what? That's not native, like eucalyptus trees in India. I went to school in Kodaikanal, and there the eucalyptus trees are a hazard, but they keep being planted because they grow fast. The British introduced them from Australia. They grow quickly, but they have shallow roots and suck up all the water, kills the native species. They topple. One fell on our roof when I was in boarding school. So I have a connection to eucalyptus, but we think of those as native, but they are not, right? That doesn't mean there aren't native species, and we can now use Google to look that up. And we aren't going to change that. We can't put the genie in the bottle. But it's important to know about as we read these works of literature. So what is post-colonial eco-criticism? Each of these two parts already encompasses a vast repertoire of scholarship concerning an equally large corpus of literary works, so that we can go back and read, as you know, say Shakespeare's The Tempest or Midsummer Night's Dream through an eco-critical lens. At the same time, we have more and more and more works being written from all around the world that are wonderful works that are environmentally conscious explicitly. This course touches on the most salient features of these, so that we can offer interpretations of books like The Hungry Tide, right? Different ways of looking at this. So the aim is to introduce the combined application of these approaches. The most obvious motivations that post-colonialism and eco-criticism share broadly is to decenter dominant discourses or institutionalized ideologies, if you want to use another synonym for discourse, and habits of thinking, to decenter those. Post-colonialism obviously aims to decenter European colonial discourses and their legacies. Eco-criticism decenters the human subject as the end-all of perception and existence by demonstrating that natural environments are equally important, just as important as human environments. Indeed, since humans are part of nature, it's in our interest to understand how we intersect with that. All humans must contend with the challenges of making their way in an often difficult world, but as we will see, and as you probably know, colonized peoples or anyone who is oppressed in some way, because the great thing about post-colonial critique is you can apply it to, as we'll see, to Native Americans, indigenous peoples in where our land is on Native American land. In my university, for example, we acknowledge that. So how we can apply the post-colonial concepts to those, and how oppressed peoples have to contend with additional psychological and material burdens. So everyone has to contend with that to some degree. But we know the added, right, cultural fragmentation and so forth. So writers who effectively describe the combination of those layers produce works that I believe are among the richest and most thought-provoking today. My theory has always been, teaching post-colonial literature, that one reason it's so popular around the world is, of course, brilliant writing, but also because so many people these days feel decentered, feel dislocated, feel disoriented. Doesn't mean they share the same experiences. But now I also add to that we also feel climate change, right? So I was talking with a professor here about how heavy the rains are now here in parts of Rajasthan, how everywhere you go, climate is changing. No question. We do have, unfortunately, in our country, quite a few climate deniers, but that's another challenge. As we explore this topic, so bear in mind the historical aspects, and as I mentioned, and how, as we know in Romanticism, keep in mind that the paradox is always that as humans progress and become more industrialized and more urban, they then realize what they've lost. Sometimes is it too late? I don't know. The post-colonial scholar Rob Nixon, now known as a post-colonial eco-critic, he didn't start that way, noted in an essay 20 years ago that although he and others had been linking post-colonial concerns to environmental ones, the two critical approaches had not yet been formally conjoined. So that was 20 years ago. Now they have been. But I think it's worth listening to what he says because we have to remember this history. Nixon proposed several reasons for the schism, as he called it, that are still worth bearing in mind. First, he argued, whereas post-colonial critique had rightly emphasized history and the messiness or hybridity of cultures, that's important, right? So whereas post-colonial studies had done that, environmentalist scholars had tended to highlight nature as timeless and pure, right? That was the history. I would say more like until maybe 30 years ago. That was a common view, timeless and pure. And we still get that attitude, right? Second, noted Nixon, post-colonial critics had been preoccupied with depictions and theorizations of displacement. Rightly so. Displacement, migration, diaspora, so on. While environmentalist critics had emphasized what he calls the literature of place. So being emplaced, right? Third, post-colonial studies had favored transnationalism and cosmopolitanism, right? If you think of Homi Bhabha and that kind of thing, and Edward Said. In contrast to environmentalists stressing bioregionalism and a tendency to approach literary depictions of natural environments within a national framework, especially with the rise of ecocriticism in the US, starting in the roughly around 1990-ish, maybe the late 80s, you had overemphasis on American ways of thinking, American literary examples. And this then, once it came into contact with post-colonial, broadened out and became much, much richer and more accurate. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, where post-colonial studies focused on marginalized communities and other forms of oppression, environmental studies continued to erase such communities in their zeal for writings about landscape, much as European painters, for example, had done 2 centuries before. This is Nixon's argument 20 years ago. And although we've come much further along now, it's useful to keep that history in mind. So what Nixon calls environmentalists' exclusionary ethics of place, such as the nature writer John Muir, as anyone studies American literature, he was actually from Scotland originally, but he was instrumental in institutionalizing the first national parks in the US, which is very important. But I've hiked some of those parks, and what you realize is, if you're listening, even the signs will tell you that to create the parks, certain numbers of Native Americans were displaced, right? In the 1890s, 1900, like that, which is sort of forgotten. So people come to them with this idea that these have been pure and empty of people, which is not true. When local inhabitants were championed, as Marxist critic Raymond Williams did, in favoring rootedness, right, or natural communities, he called them, in small town England, and which was good. Again, he was coming from a Marxist viewpoint, but he favored that. He went quite far, and he favored that over immigrations of more visibly different people. That's Raymond Williams, which is troubling, ironically, because he influenced Edward Said so much. The Black British sociologist Paul Gilroy, who famously inaugurated Black Atlantic studies, rightly objected to these sentiments as well a long time ago. So Nixon notes that postcolonialism can help, and I'm quoting here, can help diversify our thinking beyond the dominant paradigms of wilderness, unquote. The kind of gentleman farmer that for example, the American, one of the founding members of America, Thomas Jefferson, advocated, right? Again, erasing Native peoples. So the gentleman farmer idea also erases the experience of this hybridity, displacement, and transnational memory. So that's what post-colonialism brings to eco-criticism. So it can foster a transnational ethics of place that can help us rethink the pastoral. We'll come to some of those terms, pastoral and pastoralism, in terms of colonial and post-colonial concerns. So whereas Raymond Williams had pioneered the rethinking of English pastoralism by drawing attention to the harsh labor that produced it, right, which inspires Edward Said in Culture and Imperialism to, for example, in 1993, to talk about how if you read Jane Austen, you can read it through a lens of saying why all those big manors and estates were created on the backs of plantations built on slave labor, right? It's troubling to, if you like Austen, right? Some people say, oh no, that ruins my appreciation. But it's not Jane Austen we're attacking. It's providing a context. So I think that's important to keep in mind. To illustrate how a post-colonial eco-critical approach can illuminate post-colonial texts, Nixon offers the example of V.S. Naipaul, on whom he had written originally when he was younger, who he argues expressed an environmental double consciousness. So here we get this interesting aspect of certain diasporic writers, especially the older generation. As a young immigrant to England from Trinidad and Tobago, Naipaul famously strove to emulate the English, right? To be more English than the English, as he records in his autobiographical novel, The Enigma of Arrival. He saw himself through one eye as a successor to the, quote, imaginative lineage of English pastoral, unquote, like Constable, painter Constable, Gray, the poet Gray, Thomas Gray, Wordsworth, and Hardy. Through his other eye, however, Naipaul, coming from Trinidad and Tobago, recalls this is what I think Nixon puts it very nicely, painful dystopian shadow garden of the transatlantic plantation that made that idyll possible. I want you to remember that term plantation, because when we come to African American writing, we'll talk about that. That haunts certain African American writers. So he could see, he knew that, right, Naipaul. So I think he was classically ambivalent. Donald Worcester, Worcester is a environmental historian, well known. In his 1994 book, he said that the development of ecological awareness has been notably ambivalent about its goals, sometimes leaning towards an idealization of nature, Arcadian, that's the term, sort of idea, an idle, sort of pure nature idea, while also projecting a colonialist attitude to nature. That's what Kate Rigby argues, the philosopher. She's a literary critic, but writes about the history of environmental philosophy. The sociologist Bruno Latour coined the term culture nature, which is similar to Donna Haraway's nature culture. So this idea that you can't divorce them. So there, you can see different scholars thinking along the same wavelengths, as often happens, more or less at the same time, not necessarily directly influenced by one another. I know I'm throwing out a lot of terms, but remember, some of this will be in my notes will be on provided to the Gyan course later. But also, if you think of any, just make down any questions or things we can talk about later, or I'd be happy to. Another example is Jamaica Kincaid, the writer who came from Antigua in the Caribbean, tiny island, and emigrated to the US and changed her name. And so she called herself Jamaica. There are different reasons for that. She wasn't from Jamaica, but she wanted to accentuate the Caribbean. And she became a garden columnist for not a columnist, but a garden essayist for the New Yorker. And in her famous short volume, anti-tourist volume, A Small Place, excoriated tourism, which is another aspect I would love to talk about, which is on my new current topic of pilgrimage, which over intersects, but I won't go off there yet. But it does involve environmental. Am I talking too fast? Can you, okay. It's hard, sometimes I get carried away, so. So in an essay in the New Yorker magazine a long time ago called Alien Soil, Kincaid describes her paradoxical situation. If in England she is on alien soil, in her home island of Antigua, where none of the people and few of the plants are native, remember the Philippines example, the soil constitutes the historic ground of her alienation. That's an interesting way to think about it, right? The ground has been totally changed, right? So when I say, what is my home ground? That's literal, like, it's not what it was, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind. She acknowledges the paradox that although she did not grow up with the luxury of home gardening, which is a luxury, as an adult, she learned to cherish this practice that the English had perfected. We could add to this list, Amitav Ghosh and many other writers, but I think you get the general idea. So with this broad backdrop in mind, we can address such questions in the week ahead, and also bear in mind such questions as what led writers and thinkers who were mostly based in cities, let's be honest, to be more cognizant of their natural surroundings? What kinds of texts did they produce? And what outlooks characterize these texts? What are some of the prominent tropes that these texts share and why? How have such outlooks, even as they change over time, informed writers around the world and influenced writers around the world, especially with regard to the powerful role human societies have played in reshaping planetary natures and cultures? So those are some of the things to keep in mind. There's also the one question about how we have recent critiques of social structures of dominance and oppression, such as in modern colonialism, changed our understanding of how we view and describe nature. So we can also now talk, as even some anthropologists and ecologists do, about colonizing nature, right? So it's not just human. One of the influential writers early in the day from the American rise of ecocriticism is Lawrence Buell. And in his 1995 book, The Environmental Imagination, Thoreau, Nature, Writing, and the Formation of American Culture, he writes, quote, "The natural environment as empirical reality has been made to subserve human interests, and one of these interests has been made to make it serve as a symbolic reinforcement of the subservience of disempowered groups, non-whites, women, and children." In plain English, in America, especially the settler nation of America, not the indigenous, nature was a key part of its symbolic colonial conquest, and how it was writing about nature to its growing populace. And so that's part of it. And so this depended on subjugation of peoples, right? Groups. And so that's important. And that was in 1995. So that's 30 years. He advocates in that book, the nurturing of an environmental imagination, as he calls it, that combines aesthetics and ethics. That's tough, difficult to do, right? In the reading and interpretation of texts responsive to the natural environment. So post-colonial ecocriticism expands the ethical and historical purview of the environmental imagination, because he had not originally taken into account post-colonial, but he was just starting to. It expands this purview to consider how readers can be attuned to colonialism, environmental justice and racism, economic justice, among other issues, right? And as Graham Huggan and Helen Tiffin put it in their useful book, which is somewhat dated now, 2010, Post-Colonial Ecocriticism, they say that this study explicitly advocates ethical regard for both the real world it inhabits and the imaginary spaces it opens up. So in this sense, at the end of this week, we'll touch on an area that is not my specialty, which is speculative fiction, climate fiction, because as we know, the imaginative work of writers is key. We don't want to forget that. And how we imagine the future. So I think a lot of leaders and writers, leaders and thinkers today are reading speculative fiction. For example, Obama has advocated it, and some others. I do want to say that post-colonial studies by itself has, as you know, always been driven by an ethical drive, a drive for justice, right? To reveal, expose the injustices of colonialism or colonial dynamics, and at the same time to try to effect some change. So now, just to sum up what I've been saying, that impetus now also enters into ecocriticism. So for not to talk about pure ideas like John Muir had in mind, pure landscapes, but to think about how are we colonizing nature, and also who have we displaced in order to create this sort of perfect idea. Right. And one of the key words, concepts, and that you, as you know, as we'll see in American literature, is wilderness, but we'll come to that. In terms of post-colonial writers, I think post-colonial critique as a whole heeds the call of writers like the Martinican writers Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire, and the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, to decolonize the mind, right? I was, again, reiterating what I've said. Also, post-colonial criticism, eco-criticism, then calls us to decolonize our thinking about the environment, since we have sought to colonize nature. Animal studies has similarly taken up the lessons of post-colonial studies. So animal studies has been around for quite some time, but with the input of post-colonial critique, then notes the anthropogenic consequences for the planet. So human-made changes to the planet gives us that term that I know you've seen, Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene, it's a debate among scientists whether to accept it. So they recently voted in their big international meeting earlier this year, a year ago, not to accept it, but many do, scientists do. And they say there's no question that humans have shaped the environment, but is it to the extent to call it another era, geological period? That's another question. But the Anthropocene is something we need to keep in mind. We could also cite the work of Pablo Mukherjee, the post-colonial critic, who has written on many different areas, but who has shown how uneven economic development in post-colonial regions, so uneven economics, has precipitated ecological crises. I think this applies all over the world now. So building, even in the US, building on wetlands, and then people are surprised that they have flooding, right? When there's a storm that normally the wetlands would have absorbed. Similarly, the environmental literary historian Kate Rigby has pointed out that the human construction of nature, capitalized, has derived from writing systems as early as the Sumerians. So she goes even further back. Rigby argues that we must therefore acknowledge that this construction, like all human ones, is never free, she says, from our entanglement with the natural material world. She calls for I don't know if this will catch on, but an eco-poetics of negativity that emphasizes the inevitable failure that the written word to restore the presence of the natural material world. In other words, there's always been a longing to kind of capture the presence of that perfect land, world or nature that we think of, but we cannot do it. But this can be productive. We can never accurately capture that in writing or any art, but we have to try, right? And I think that's the conclusion they come to. So I'll begin also by looking at some of the romantic poets that I think I had as one of the handouts. I know you may not have had time to read everything, but these are famous poets, so you probably have encountered them. And if you later on you haven't gotten to the readings, you can read later, right? There's so many, it's such a wide range. So bear with me. So that's the broad overview. So let's look at some specific poems real quickly. And again, I'll fill in some terms, critical terms as we go today. We all know perhaps, or have at least heard about William Wordsworth's Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. One of my colleagues is a Wordsworth scholar, so I have to ask him for suggestions. But I'm not going to read all of this, but the part that starts 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, right? And many scholars, including the philosopher Timothy Morton, I'm getting old, so my brain takes a minute to use the database. But Timothy Morton is interesting because he's a philosopher, but he knows he has a degree in romanticism too. So so a lot of writers turn to these kinds of writers as, remember I said there's romantic movement. In English literature, we tend to look at the English romantics, but the Germans really started a generation earlier. And so he's going back, so memory plays a big role here. Recollecting, after all, what is writing? It has to involve memory, right? You're not recording instantly as you go, right? He says down below, once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms, green to the very door. Or maybe I should talk with an English accent, I don't know. With some uncertain choice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods. Now, he says, might seem like there are no houses in the woods, right? But he's aware that there are people here. Now, this is different this is Europe. This is a tiny space in England. This is not, the New World where the settlers are displacing people. But even in Europe, they did this to some degree. Or of some hermit's cave where by his fire the hermit sits alone. So we have classic romantic tropes like solitude, the individual reflecting on his or her place in nature, and idealizing nature to some degree, right? Then he says, these beauteous forms through a long absence have not been to me as a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. So the other aspect, of course, is the feelings. It's okay now to talk about feelings, right? At this point in European poetry. So he goes on like this, and it's a beautiful poem. And then he also says, just a couple of lines I'd like to read aloud because they are often quoted, or they also perhaps evoke certain themes that I think are important. He talks about a sense of, I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns. So again, I think he's grasping for some connection to nature, right? That's deep. The word sublime, we can talk about. We could also talk about this idea of nature as, in this case, being kind of a material form that elicits psychological reactions. So it's mainly serving the poet, right, at this point. So there's nothing wrong. I mean, this is beautiful. We're just reading this from our point of view, that it's not, it's a beginning of, it's a start to seeing the environment in a new way, but it's got a long way to go. I think you all know about the sublime, but let me just say quickly, in a nutshell, it was a philosophical concept. A lot of people writing in, like Edmund Burke in the 1700s, but also was this idea of more than just beauty. It would trigger this paradoxical feeling of awe and human insignificance. Now that's, I think, interesting because I see it revived recently. People using it, right, in post-humanist critique. This idea of we are insignificant, how do we express this? Now, Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement, in his essay 9 years ago, was eloquent as usual, talking about the need to articulate this. He did raise the ire of climate fiction writers because he hasn't read much of that, and he kind of said he never mentioned it a whole lot. But he did make the good point that we are insignificant, right? Now more than ever, because of climate change, how can we articulate that? That's the great challenge. If that's one thing to take away from this course, that's the great challenge. And I think there are writers but we could talk more about that. Then he says, this interesting thing caught my eye towards the end of this first part actually the end of the Tintern Abbey section. He says, Wordsworth says, where to pick this up? He talks about solitude, fear, pain, grief. Nor perchance if I should be where I no more can hear thy voice, nor catch from thy wild eyes those gleams of past existence. Wilt thou then forget that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together, that I, so long a worshipper of nature, he capitalizes nature, hither came unwearied in that service. And then he ends by saying, talking about this green pastoral landscape. Right now, he's talking about his sister Dorothy, but it struck me that this idea of he doesn't mention her directly, right? He says my companion, and you can read this in other ways as well. And it caught my attention that in Anandamat by Bankim Chandra, there's also this disembodied voice. Now that tends to be the divine voice, but there's something about people who, these romantics, when they go out in nature, sometimes it's just a purely metaphorical voice, right? Here, I think you can read it as both the voice of his sister and metaphorical. Does that make sense? But he's not religious per se, he's more spiritual, whereas Bankim Chandra was more religious. But I think you can see Bankim Chandra had been influenced by the romantics, I think, there. It's my view, to some degree. So we'll come back to that. So these are the cross sections that are influenced. But aside from that, just keep in mind, sublime, solitude, these things. Now that will inform John Muir's view, for example, of wilderness. It tended to be, not surprisingly, a male view. And even John Muir, even up until only the 20th century, it was predominantly male. Men had this sort of liberty to roam around, right? and men usually get lost, so that maybe was part of it, but I'm just joking. But this idea that that Muir would invoke some of the same ideas, the sublime, right? Even though he wasn't a poet, but he was a good writer. Okay, how much time? Let's see. Then we come to Shelley, The West Wind. I won't read much from this, but again, he talks about, "O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing." It's very interesting, right, to think about when you look at it in light of this sort of, here's someone trying to respond to nature, and why choose these particular words? And I think and then he says something that sounds very much like he's read Mahabharata or something. He says, "Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver," right? So there you start to see sort of these clues to the sense that they have been inspired by the translations that were fairly recent from Indian works. That's fascinating, right? He also talks about, I'm just reading these to give us a sense, "If I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee," right? "Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed." Again, trying to enter that, this idea, as Wordsworth did, of connecting with nature. So these are important because if you think of it in literary history, how they inform later writers. We have Coleridge. You all know the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but again, I think one way to read it is that it's a transgression against nature. That's one way to read this, right? You don't have to read it that way, but that enriches our understanding of it. And I think, so that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so I think we started at 11:15, so we still have about 15, 20 minutes. So I know it's a long time to sit, so if you need to stretch, please do so. Try not to yawn, but, stretch. No, I'm just joking. So, American Romantics and Transcendentalists. So James Fenimore Cooper, writing, he lived from 1789 to 1851. Some of you may know this. If not, it's an interesting piece of literary history. He wrote The Last of the Mohicans and a lot of those kinds of, he called them the Deerslayer novels based on his main character. He was a best-selling writer in Europe because he had imbibed those romantic ideals. But here's now where we get to the American side that's been very influential. That's why I mentioned it, but I'm glad we're getting away from that these days. For a long time, it was influential, where the idea of a wilderness, for example, first of all, the romanticization of the noble savage. Do you know this idea of the noble savage, right? That Rousseau had talked about. And so this idea that it's a condescending view of the native, of the indigenous, that they're in touch with nature. I think we still have that a lot, I'm sorry to say, in a lot of our works of literary criticism, everywhere in the world, I see it. This idea that, oh yes, they're in touch with nature, aren't they great? But it's more like you're objectifying them. You're not really humanizing them, and as if they don't have an agency of their own. So I'm just generalizing here. So anyway, he was very famous for that. But it's always a white European guy, settler, who masters, this trope, masters the indigenous thinking more than the indigenous, so can traverse both the European sort of civilized sector as well as this noble savage. Am I making sense? Anyway, I'd love to talk about it more. But here's what he says, just snippets. to give you a sense, right? On that day, and this is prose, this is a novel. It's very fast moving, right? Very, you know. On that day, two men were lingering on the banks of a small but rapid stream, within an hour's journey of the encampment of Webb, like those who awaited the appearance of an absent person or the approach of some unexpected event. The vast canopy of woods spread itself to the margin of the river, overhanging the water and shadowing its dark current with a deeper hue. The rays of the sun were beginning to grow less fierce, and the intense heat of the day was lessened as the cooler vapors of the springs and fountains rose above their leafy beds and rested in the atmosphere. It sounds very nice, right? Jungle retreat, right? Still, that breathing silence which marks the drowsy sultriness of an American landscape, that begs a lot of questions. In July, now he's also writing for an Eastern US audience, also European, but Eastern, which had been settled. This is supposed to take place in the, the forested areas. Pervaded the secluded spot, interrupted only by the low voices of men, the occasional and lazy tap of a woodpecker, the discordant cry of some gaudy jay, so a bird, or a swelling on the ear from the dull roar of a distant waterfall. So again, this idea of being in this pristine environment, and you could have argued, oh, well, he's advocating for protection of this, but that's not really so. He's talking about the fact that the settlers are, when he says American, he doesn't mean Native American. He does mean that it might incorporate some of their ideas because the Americans wanted to be distinct from Europe, right? They were still fine. This was when they were starting to become more confident in their writing, right? After some decades. And he goes on and talks about, then he talks about the Native American. His body, which was nearly naked, presented a terrific emblem of death, drawn in intermingled colors of white and black. His closely shaved head, on which no other hair than the well-known and chivalrous sculpting tuft was preserved, was without ornament of any kind, with the exception of a solitary eagle's plume. And he goes on and sort of an objectification of the native. Now, it's ironically, I think I don't know if you know, there was 30 years ago some film version of Last of the Mohicans with Daniel Day-Lewis in the role. So you get these kind of weird, he's also, white men playing sort of these liminal figures. So that's Cooper. So I want to keep Cooper in mind because arguably some of the early Indian nationalist writers, starting in 1930s, like Derozio, had read Cooper, right? Arguably, we don't know direct evidence, but the British allowed certain novels to be published in India, and Cooper was one of those. But I don't know directly. But even if it's secondhand, they get these ideas. Then we get Henry David Thoreau talking about, I mentioned, he says, I went to the woods, famous opening. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Beautiful, eloquent, powerful. But he also talks in other parts of, you could hear the train whistle. Right? Walden is not, this was a place in Connecticut that was the closest he could come. He had an opportunity to go to this place. He's not going too far beyond civilization. He's not going to live purely on his own, and he doesn't claim to. And I think it's still a powerful piece of writing. But it's interesting to think and keep in our mind that he could hear civilization, right there. And he talks about the sublime, whether he would find this, and he goes on to read. And then he, of course, as I said, he often quotes the Upanishads and other things. And he famously says, still we live meanly, meaning we humans, like ants. Though the fable tells us that we were long ago changed into men, Like pygmies, we fight with cranes. It is error upon error and clout upon clout, and our best virtue has for its occasion a superfluous and evitable wretchedness. Our life is frittered away by detail. I'm thinking, boy, he had not seen anything yet. I mean, that's what he thought in the 49, right? And we think, oh, people were less commercialized then? Not really. I mean, I think relatively less, but they were still aware of, I think the fact is that if he were alive today, it'd be interesting to think about what he would say, right? Anyway, that's Thoreau. Another part of the survey is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who talks about, Leo Marx is a critic who talks about The Machine in the Garden, an influential American work on, the title, I think, metaphorically says it, the machine industry entering the garden landscape. But he too has a kind of idealized view of nature. But this is what Nathaniel Hawthorne writes, Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter and those texts, right? Also very much in tune with nature, And one of the progenitors of a distinctly American literary taste and style, more than, and subject matter. He says, but this is Hawthorne, but hark, there's the whistle of the locomotive, the long shriek, harsh above all other harshness. For the space of a mile cannot mollify it into harmony. It tells a story of busy men, citizens from the hot street, who have come to spend a day in a country village, men of business. In short, of all unquietness. And no wonder that it gives such a startling shriek, since it brings the noisy world into the midst of our slumberous peace. Right? So again, this idea of, as the Romantics had, of the invasion of nature. And then we go on and we could talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson, but I'll go on and I just want to give a snippet in closing of this survey of John Muir. Now, he wrote many things. And this one is a snippet from A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf, which was a journal that he kept in 1867. So it was an early piece when he was younger, and it wasn't published until 1916, after he had died. So he says, the live oaks, and he went down to southeastern US into Florida and things like that. The live oaks of these keys divide empire with the long-leafed pine and palmetto, but in many places on the mainland, there are large tracts exclusively occupied by them. Like the Bonaventure oaks, they have the upper side of their main spreading branches thickly planted with ferns, grasses, small saw palmettos, etc. There's a dwarf oak here, which forms dense thickets. The oaks of this key, that is the Florida Keys, these little islands, like those of the Wisconsin openings, growing on grassy slopes, but stand sunk to the shoulders in flowering magnolias, heathworts, etc. Now, this is a journal, so he does a lot of etc., and things like that. And then just one more line. The world, we are told, was made especially for man, a presumption not supported by all the facts. So here, Muir does sound like he's saying we have to accept nature on its own terms. So he was ahead of his times in that. It's not just for humans. But in creating, he never talks about the Native Americans, right? That's the paradox. So he's typical of this product of his times. Even Thoreau does not. And so, of course, we're reading them in hindsight, but still, it's a notable absence. So I want to pause there, and we just have a couple more minutes. I know I haven't, let's see, see how far I'm getting in this first lecture. Yeah, so I am going to go and come back to some of the key parts of key terms in ecocriticism. But before we have about 3-4 minutes of this first lecture, I want to touch on some of the those very quickly. In the modern ecocritical environment on writing, that is modern sense of awareness, because nature writing has been there forever, but in the modern sense of awareness of pollution, of how humans have polluted the world, of course, the main person who comes to mind is Rachel Carson in 1962, right? Silent Spring, which led directly to governments discontinuing things like DDT. It took a few years. And she was a scientist as well as an eloquent writer, which made it a bestseller. And she was also not taken seriously because she was female at the time. That quickly changed, I think. But I love how this starts. And in case you're new to it, it's a wonderful way to teach it as well. She starts with a 3-page opening called A Fable for Tomorrow that you may be familiar with. And again, it's fable-like. There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings, and invoking the ancient tradition of the pastoral, goes on to paint a picture of prosperous farms, green fields, foxes barking in the hills, silent deer, ferns and wildflowers, countless birds, and trout. And I'm summarizing some of this. They all were all delighted in by those who passed through the town. And then she says, so it's an invasion motif. So we have an ideal town. She says this is like once upon a time. And then she says, then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Some evil spell had settled on the community. Mysterious maladies swept the flocks of chickens, the cattle and sheep sickened and died. Everywhere was a shadow of death. And that's it's so poetic. Then she says, a little below, on the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was no sound. Only silence lay over the fields and woods and marsh. So what we get here, one thing to maybe, I haven't gone through everything in this what I hope to in lecture one, is the genres of pastoralism on the one hand and apocalyptic literature on the other hand, that she doesn't know she is invoking a genre, but it's this notion that comes from religious writings, for example, the idea of apocalypse, right? But now invoked in modern, everyday America. So we have the pastoralism, she says, she's not saying it was real, but it was certainly, she's trying to grab people's attention. And that's how you grab a reader's attention. And then you have this apocalypse that comes, and she actually invokes, she cites John Keats's poem, La Belle Dame sans Merci. She says, in which magical power of a beautiful woman blights the environment. This is Keats. The sedge is withered from the lake and no birds sing. So she uses that to talk about, right, to capture people's imagination as well. So I think that's wonderful. So I can maybe start the next lecture with invoking a couple of these other writers like Vandana Shiva and so forth. But this idea that we have pastoralism and apocalypse, we also have toxic discourse. The toxic discourse we could talk about. She didn't coin that term. Lawrence Buell coined it many years later in the 1990s, but that fits with what she was doing. So we've come a long way. We made a big survey, right? And I'll conclude this lecture there. I think it's been exactly 1 hour, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, thanks.